In the shadow of the mountain sea, 1650 BC, the camera sweeps over a rugged mountainous land. Jagged ridges catch the first light of dawn. Valleys lie deep in shadow, their rivers shimmering like silver threads in the morning haze. Far below, smoke curls lazily from the hearths of small stone villages. This is central Anatolia, a land of extremes. Summers are blistering and dry. Winters bite hard with frost and snow.
Ow.
The soil here is stubborn, and life has never been easy. And yet it is here in this harsh but fertile highland that one of the great powers of the ancient world would be born. Around 2000 BC, Anatolia was no empire. It was a patchwork quilt of small, walled city-states, each clinging to its own hilltop, each ruled by its own petty king. Between them lay open stretches of farmland, dotted with herds of sheep and oxen, and beyond, wild forests where wolves and bears roamed. Life revolved around survival. Farmers coaxed barley and wheat from the stubborn soil. Traders moved in caravans along dusty roads, bringing tin from faraway lands to mix with local copper, forging the bronze that armed soldiers and craftsmen alike. And in the courts of these little kings, politics was personal, an endless dance of alliance, rivalry, and betrayal. Into this world came a new people, the Hittites. Their exact origins are still debated, but their language places them among the Indo-European family. Distant cousins to the Greeks, the Persians, and the Aryans of India, they were not the first to live in these lands. Before them had come the Hassians, a mysterious people whose gods, festivals, and traditions the Hittites would later adopt and adapt. The result was a culture that was both foreign and native, one that could blend the old with the new. They built their first settlements in defensible places, steep ridges, rocky outcrops, and hills overlooking rivers. Thick stone walls, crowned with wooden palisades, ringed their towns. Inside, narrow streets wound between houses of mud, brick, and timber. At the center stood the palace and the temple, twin symbols of power on earth and in heaven. One city would become the beating heart of this new power, Hattusa. Perched high on a ridge, it was both fortress and home, protected on three sides by cliffs and ravines. From its walls, a sentry could see for miles, watching the approach of friend or foe along the trade routes that threaded through Anatolia. The early Hittite kings were as much diplomats as warriors. They understood that in a land of many rival lords, outright conquest could be dangerous. Instead, they wove a web of alliances. Marriages were arranged between royal families. Trade treaties were signed, their terms carved into clay tablets. And above all, oaths were sworn before the gods, oaths the Hittites took seriously. For to break them was to invite divine wrath. Religion was everywhere. The Hittites worshipped a vast pantheon, taking gods from the Hassians, the Hurrians, and even Mesopotamian neighbors. Chief among them was the storm god Tarhunt, who rode upon the clouds, bringing rain to nourish the crops and lightning to smite enemies. In the great festivals, priests offered bread, wine, and sacrificed animals to the gods, while musicians played lutes and drums, their rhythms echoing against the stone walls. This combination of diplomacy, religion, and military readiness slowly expanded Hittite influence. Neighboring city-states began to fall under their sway, some through alliance, others through war. And with each new victory, the Hittites learned more. Adopting siege tactics from Mesopotamia, military organization from Syria, and administrative systems from the Assyrians. By the mid-17th century BC, the Hittites were no longer just one kingdom among many. They had become a regional power, and they were looking beyond their mountains, toward the richer lands to the south. Their eyes fell on the wealthy cities of Syria, and far beyond, the legendary powers of Mesopotamia. The age of petty kings was ending. The age of empire was about to begin. Blood and Empire c. 1650 to 1500 BC. The Hittites had risen from a loose confederation of hilltop cities to a united kingdom under a single crown. Their walls stood strong. Their gods favored them. But the mountains that had sheltered them for centuries now felt like boundaries. And the kings of Hattusa began to dream of more. It was during the reign of Hattusa I that these dreams took shape. A warrior king of ambition and iron will, Hattusa understood that Anatolia alone could not make the Hittites great. The wealth of the world lay to the south. In the trade-rich cities of Syria, where caravans brought goods from Egypt, Babylonia, and the Levant, whoever held Syria could control the arteries of Bronze Age commerce. From the citadel of Hattusa, Hattusa looked outward. He began a campaign that would carry the Hittite name far beyond the mountains. With a disciplined army of spearmen, archers, and charioteers, he marched south, toppling city after city. The Hittite army was a force to be reckoned with. Their infantry fought in tight ranks, protected by large shields and armed with thrusting spears. Their archers rained volleys of arrows before the charge of the chariots, swift, two-wheeled machines pulled by teams of horses, carrying a driver and a warrior armed with a spear or bow. The chariot was not just a weapon. It was a statement of royal power. But campaigns were costly, and war was never far from politics. Hattusa faced unrest at home, even betrayal from his own family. His own nephew, once named heir, turned against him. The king responded ruthlessly, stripping him of power and naming a new successor. The message was clear. Loyalty to the king was not optional. When Hattusa died, his chosen heir, Mursili, inherited not only a growing kingdom, but a dangerous opportunity. Mursili was young, but he had inherited his predecessor's ambition. Where Hattusa had pushed deep into Syria, Mursili looked even further to the heart of Mesopotamia itself. In the year 1595 BC, Mursili led his army on an expedition that would stun the ancient world. From Hattusa, they crossed Anatolia, marched through Syria, pushed into Mesopotamia, bypassing stronger local powers through speed, surprise, and relentless advance. Their destination was Babylon, one of the greatest and wealthiest cities on earth. It's the seat of the first Babylonian dynasty founded by the legendary Hammurabi. The records do not tell us exactly how Mursili breached Babylon's defenses. Some believe treachery from within opened the gates. Others imagine siege engines battering its walls. But when the dust settled, Babylon had fallen. Its treasures were looted, its temples plundered, and its proud dynasty ended. And then just as quickly, the Hittites were gone. They had not come to occupy Babylon. It was too far from home, too costly to hold. Their army turned north, laden with spoils, leaving a power vacuum in Mesopotamia that would be filled by the rising Kassites. It was the most daring raid of the age, proof that no city, however mighty, was beyond the reach of the Hittite king. But glory is a dangerous prize. The long march home had stretched resources and tested loyalties. In the shadows of Hattusa's great citadel, whispers turned to plots. Not long after returning Mursili, was murdered, struck down by his own brother-in-law, in a palace coup. The king who had humbled Babylon was gone, and with him the momentum of conquest. The empire he had fought to build stood leaderless, its throne contested. Outside the city walls, enemies stirred. Inside, the blood of kings stained the palace floors. The Hittites had tasted the heights of power, but now they stood on the edge of chaos. The Babylonian thunder, c. 1595 to 1500 BC. The thunder of Hittite chariot wheels had once rolled through the streets of Babylon. The smoke of victory had risen over the temples of the great city. Mursili had struck the first Babylonian dynasty like a sudden storm, swift, violent, and unexpected. But just as storms passed, so too did the Hittite presence vanish from Mesopotamia. The army returned home triumphant, bringing back treasures, captives, and stories that would echo for generations. But beneath the songs of victory, darker sound was growing, the quiet sharpening of knives in the shadows of Hattusa's palace. Mursili's return was not met with universal celebration. The king had spent years away, pouring resources into a campaign far from home. The plunder was vast, but so was the cost. In lives, supplies, and political stability, ambitious men saw opportunity in his absence, and when he returned, those ambitions had hardened into conspiracy. The assassin was no foreign enemy but family, his own brother-in-law Hantili, a man who should have been his loyal ally. In a coup that shocked the kingdom, Mursili was murdered. The conqueror of Babylon fell not to a spear on the battlefield, but to betrayal in his own court. Hantili took the throne, but the crown he claimed was heavy with curses. In Hittite thought, the murder of a king was not just a crime against the state, it was an offense to the gods themselves. The gods, it seemed, were not blind. The years that followed were marked by unrest, invasion, and famine. In the north, the wild Kaska tribes descended from the forests of the Pontic Mountains, raiding deep into Hittite lands. They were elusive enemies, striking swiftly and vanishing into the hills before a counterattack could be mounted. To the east, the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni was rising, pressing into Syria and threatening the Hittite vassals there. The wealth and influence the Hittites had gained under Hattusili and Mursili began to slip away. Cities that had once sworn oaths of loyalty to Hattusa now looked to other powers for protection. Inside the palace, the throne changed hands with dangerous frequency. Assassination, coup, and forced abdication became familiar patterns. Kings ruled for only a few years before falling victim to the same treachery that had claimed Mursili. With each violent transfer of power, the authority of the crown weakened. The royal annals from this time are filled not with victories abroad, but with records of rebuilding burned villages, restoring crumbling fortresses, and renewing treaties with wavering allies. The empire's energies turned inward, not toward expansion, but toward survival. Even religion reflected the mood of the age. Ritual texts speak of elaborate purifications, as priests sought to cleanse the land of the sin of regicide and restore the favor of the gods. Festivals that had once been occasions of triumph now carried a somber tone. Their processions and offerings seeking protection from famine, plague, and foreign attack. Yet, despite the turmoil, the Hittites endured. Their core lands in central Anatolia remained intact. Their legal and administrative systems continued to function. The skills of their scribes, engineers, and diplomats were not lost. Like a fortress battered by siege but not yet taken, the kingdom held firm, waiting for a leader who could turn defense back into offense. That leader would come, but only after decades of uncertainty. And when he did, he would not only restore the kingdom, but forge it into an empire greater than any Hittite king had yet imagined. Rebuilding the Kingdom c. 1500 to 1380 BC. The years after Mursili's murder had left the Hittite kingdom scarred. Its borders had shrunk, its vassals had wavered. And in the echoing halls of Hattusa, the throne had become less a seat of power than a dangerous prize in a game of survival. But the Hittites were not a people easily broken. The mountains and valleys that had shaped them for centuries had also hardened them. They knew how to endure. And slowly, patiently, the kingdom began to heal. The rulers of what historians call the Middle Kingdom period were not conquerors in the mold of Hattusili or Mursili. They were repairers, stabilizers, lawgivers. Their ambitions were measured not in miles of conquered territory, but in the restoration of order and the rebuilding of trust between ruler and ruled. One of their first tasks was to reassert royal authority. The cycle of coups and assassinations had left deep wounds in the political fabric of the state. To break it, kings turned to law and ritual, issued decrees reaffirming the sacred nature of kingship, reminding the nobility that to strike against the ruler was to strike against the gods. Court ceremonies grew more elaborate, reinforcing the image of the king as the chosen intermediary between heaven and earth. The Hittite law code, one of the most humane of the ancient world, was refined and expanded. It dealt not only with crimes like theft or assault, but with property rights, marriage contracts, and the treatment of slaves. Unlike the harsher laws of Babylon, Hittite justice often favored fines or restitution over execution. The goal was not only punishment, but the restoration of balance, a concept rooted in their religious worldview. Militarily, the kings focused on defending the heartland. The stone walls of Hattusa were strengthened and extended, with massive gates guarded by lion and sphinx carvings. Watchtowers rose along the frontiers, and garrisons were re-established in key border towns. Diplomacy became as important as defense. The Hittites could not afford costly wars, so they relied on treaties and marriages to secure peace with neighbors. Kings personally traveled to meet foreign rulers, sealing alliances with oaths sworn before the gods of both nations. In this way, they bought time to rebuild their economy, their army, and their confidence. Trade, too, returned. Caravans once again moved along the great routes linking Anatolia to the Levant and Mesopotamia. Merchants brought tin, copper, textiles, grain, and wine. The influx of goods enriched the royal treasury and funded public works. In the cities, artisans resumed their craft. Potters shaped fine ceramics. Metalworkers forged weapons and ornaments. Scribes filled clay tablets with records, prayers, and contracts. Temples damaged in years of war and neglect were repaired and rededicated. Festivals returned to their former splendor with music, dance, and offerings to the gods. Celebrations that reminded the people of who they were and what they had survived. This was not an age of great battles or legendary conquests. It was an age of quiet strength, a time when the Hittites learned the value of stability. And it was this foundation, patient, deliberate, hard-won, that would allow the next generation of rulers to dream once more of expansion. For beyond the borders, the world was changing. The kingdom of Mitanni, once a rising power, was beginning to weaken. Egypt was distracted by its own affairs. And in Hattusa, a prince was growing up who would take these opportunities and turn them into a golden age. His name was Sepululiyama. Under his hand, the Hittites would once again march to war, this time not to raid, but to rule. Clash of Empires c. 1380 to 1320 BC. The years of patient rebuilding had restored the Hittite kingdom's strength. Its walls were secure, its treasury replenished, and its army once again feared by its neighbors. 8. But in Hattusa's royal court there was one man who believed that the time for cautious diplomacy was over, that the Hittites were destined for more than survival. His name was Sepululiyama. History remembers him as the greatest of all Hittite kings, a man of restless ambition, of unshakable will, and brilliance both in war and in statecraft. Sepululiyama was not born to the throne. He began his life as a prince, a younger son in a royal house that had learned the hard way how fragile kingship could be. From an early age he was trained in the arts of governance and the strategies of war. He studied the records of his predecessors, learning from both their victories and their failures. When he finally seized power, some say through a palace coup, others through legitimate succession, he inherited a kingdom ready for action. Beyond Hittite borders, the geopolitical map of the Near East was shifting. To the south and east lay the kingdom of Mitanni, a Hurrian-led state that had once been the dominant power in Syria. Mitanni was weakening, torn apart by internal disputes and pressure from a rising Assyria. Its vassal states' wealthy cities like Aleppo, Carchemish, and Kadesh were restless, ready to change allegiance if a stronger protector emerged. Sepululiyama saw his chance. He began with diplomacy, sending emissaries to the courts of Syria and beyond, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. Where persuasion failed, his armies marched. The Hittite war machine was faster and more coordinated than its rivals. Chariots led the advance, striking fear into enemy ranks, while disciplined infantry followed to take and hold ground. In a series of swift campaigns, Sepululiyama shattered Mitanni's grip on Syria. One by one, its cities either surrendered or fell under siege. Aleppo fell. Carchemish, a crucial trade hub on the Euphrates, was taken and placed under the rule of Sepululiyama's own son. By the time the dust settled, the Hittites were the undisputed masters of northern Syria. This brought them into direct confrontation with another great power, Egypt. Egypt, under the 18th dynasty, had long claimed influence over parts of Syria, especially the city of Kadesh. But Sepululiyama's campaigns left Egypt's position in the region severely weakened. The two empires now stood face to face along contested borders, the inevitable spark points of future wars. It was during this tense period that a remarkable event occurred, one of the most extraordinary diplomatic episodes in ancient history. A young Egyptian pharaoh, Tutankhamun, had died unexpectedly. His widow, known in Hittite records as Dukamunzu, found herself without an heir and surrounded by political rivals. In desperation, she sent a letter to Sepululiyama, asking for one of his sons to become her husband and Egypt's next pharaoh. It was an unprecedented proposal. A foreigner on Egypt's throne? Sepululiyama hesitated, suspicious of a trap. But the queen sent a second, more urgent message, assuring him of her sincerity. At last he agreed. His son Zenanza set out for Egypt, but he never arrived. Somewhere on the journey he was murdered, likely by factions within the Egyptian court. The insult and betrayal enraged Sepululiyama. In retaliation, he launched new campaigns against Egypt's Syrian territories, capturing key cities and further expanding Hittite control. But in the chaos of war, an unseen enemy struck. Among the captives taken from Egypt was a plague, a deadly disease that swept through the Hittite lands. It claimed thousands, and among its victims was Suppiluliuma himself. He died in the midst of his triumphs, leaving an empire at the height of its power, but one suddenly vulnerable to the ambitions of its rivals and the unpredictable course of disease and fate. Fire on the Horizon Sea. 1272, 1180 BC. The death of Suppiluliuma had been a bitter blow. But the empire he built did not crumble overnight. His successors inherited vast territories, stretching from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the banks of the Euphrates and deep into the rich lands of Syria. The Hittites now stood as one of the superpowers of the Late Bronze Age, equals to Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. At the height of this power came one of the most famous events in ancient military history, the Battle of Kadesh. The year was around 1274 BC. On the Hittite throne sat Muwatalli II, king determined to defend the empire's holdings in Syria against Egyptian encroachment. To the south, the Egyptian pharaoh, Ramesses II, later called the Great, marched north with a massive army, intent on taking Kadesh, a fortified city of immense strategic value. The two armies were the most formidable of their age. Ramesses led his forces in person, organized into divisions named after Egypt's gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. The Hittites, for their part, assembled a coalition of vassal states and allies, bringing thousands of troops and an estimated 3,500 chariots, the largest chariot force ever recorded in history. The battle began with deception. Hittite scouts fed false information to Ramesses, luring him into believing the Hittite army was far away. In reality, Muwatalli's forces lay in ambush behind Kadesh. As the Egyptian Amun division camped near the city, the Hittite chariots thundered out from hiding, smashing into the Egyptian camp in a storm of dust, arrows, and spear points. The surprise was devastating. Egyptian lines broke and chaos spread. But Ramesses, in a display of personal courage, rallied his remaining forces and counterattacked. Reinforcements from the Ptah division arrived in time to push the Hittites back across the Orontes River. The battle ended not with a decisive victory, but in stalemate. Kadesh remained under Hittite control, but Egypt's power in Syria was not destroyed. The two empires, recognizing the cost of continued war, eventually signed one of the world's first recorded peace treaties, a pact inscribed on clay tablets in Hittite and hieroglyphs on Egyptian temple walls. The treaty was more than words. It was a recognition that the balance of power had been reached. For decades afterward, Hittites and Egyptians exchanged envoys, gifts, and even royal marriages, securing peace in the Levant. But even as the great kings dined in each other's courts and swore eternal friendship, the storm clouds of collapse were gathering on the horizon. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the late 13th century BC was a time of upheaval. Migrations of mysterious peoples remembered in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples brought destruction to coastal cities. Trade routes that had carried copper, tin, grain, and luxury goods for centuries began to falter. Earthquakes shook the Aegean and Anatolia. Droughts and crop failures added to the strain. For the Hittites, the challenges were compounded by internal troubles. The Casca tribes in the north renewed their raids, burning towns and disrupting supply lines. In the west, the kingdom of Ahiawa, possibly connected to the Mycenaean Greeks, posed a growing threat. To the east, Assyria was rising once more, challenging Hittite authority in northern Mesopotamia. By the reign of Suppiluliuma II, the last known king of Hatti, the empire was struggling to hold itself together. Royal letters from this time speak of desperate attempts to secure grain shipments from Egypt to feed the starving capital. Entire provinces were lost to rebellion or foreign invasion. And then, suddenly, the written record falls silent. Hattusa, the proud capital that had stood for centuries, was abandoned and burned. Its massive walls crumbled into ruin. The script of the Hittite scribes disappeared from history, and the empire itself vanished, swallowed by the chaos of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Only legends remained, and the scattered ruins of cities that once commanded kings and armies. For more than 3,000 years, the name of the Hittites would be forgotten. But their story was not over. Far in the future, their stones would speak again. Buried and reborn for more than 3,000 years, the Hittite Empire lay silent. Its cities were overgrown with grass and wildflowers, its roads faded into the landscape, and its once proud capital, Hattusa, slept under layers of soil and rubble. In the annals of Egypt and Assyria, faint echoes of their names survived, references to a people called Hatti, but who they truly were, where they ruled, and how they vanished became a mystery swallowed by time. The Hittites appeared in passing, mentioned as one of the peoples of Canaan, but scholars debated whether these were the same Hittites of the ancient world or a different group entirely. For centuries, the great empire that had once rivaled Egypt itself remained invisible, its memory blurred and fragmented. The rebirth of their story began in the 19th century, a time when European explorers and archaeologists were scouring the Middle East in search of the civilizations mentioned in ancient texts. In 1834, a French explorer named Charles Texier traveled through central Anatolia, near the small Turkish village of Bagaski. He found the massive stone foundations of walls and gates unlike anything he had ever seen. He knew they were ancient, but he could not say who had built them. Decades later, archaeologists returned to Bagaski and began systematic excavations. What they uncovered was staggering. Colossal gateways flanked by carved lions and sphinxes, temples with vast courtyards, and thousands upon thousands of clay tablets inscribed with an unknown language. At first, no one could read them. The script, written in cuneiform, was different from the well-known Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts. It seemed to be a new tongue entirely. The breakthrough came in the early 20th century, when Czech scholar Bedřich Rosner made a bold claim. The mysterious language was Indo-European, related to Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. By 1915, he had deciphered enough to reveal the truth. These were the records of the Hittite Empire. Suddenly, history shifted. The shadowy name from Egyptian inscriptions and biblical references now had form and voice. The tablets spoke of kings like Hattusili, Mursili, and Suppiluliuma, of treaties and wars, of gods and festivals, of laws and trade. They revealed an empire that had dominated Anatolia and Syria for centuries, a superpower of the late Bronze Age that had been entirely forgotten. Further excavations at Hattusa revealed the city's grandeur. Massive walls, some stretching over 6 kilometers, enclosed palaces, temples, and administrative buildings. The Lion Gate and the King's Gate still stood, their carved guardians staring out across the Anatolian plateau. In the rock sanctuary of Yatzilika, reliefs of gods and goddesses marched in solemn procession, a stone pantheon frozen in time. As the pieces fell into place, the Hittites emerged not as a footnote in the history of Egypt or Mesopotamia, but as a civilization in their own right, innovators in diplomacy, masters of chariot warfare, and skilled administrators who governed a multi-ethnic empire with remarkable efficiency. Today, the story of the Hittites is told not only through ancient texts and broken walls, but through the landscapes they once ruled. The wind still sweeps across the ruins of Hattusa. The carved lions still guard its gates. And in museums from Ankara to Berlin, the clay tablets of their scribes still whisper the story of a people who rose from the mountains, built an empire and vanished into legend, only to be reborn through the work of those who refused to let their memory die. The Hittites are no longer lost. Their stones, their words, and their history have returned to the light. And though their empire fell more than 3 millennia ago, their legacy of resilience, ambition, and the rise and fall of power still speaks to us today.